In 1933, a 20-year-old Raja in Bengal was standing in the Calcutta railway station when he felt someone collide with him, a sharp pain emanating from his arm. 8 days later, he was in a hospital bed, burning up with a fever as his lungs filled with fluid. As the young man was fighting for his life, his older brother was taking a joyride through the streets of Calcutta, spending lakhs of rupees from his younger brother's bank account on expensive cars, premium whiskies, and women. But the Calcutta police realized that this was no ordinary case of an unlucky infection. The young man was dying from a disease that hadn't even been seen in Calcutta in over 3 years, and according to his family, his older brother's behavior in the last several months had been highly suspicious. But little did they know that the investigation would reveal one of the most outlandish criminal cases in the history of British India, a murder plot inspired by a Sherlock Holmes story, and the lengths to which a greedy Raja would go to take the life of his very own brother. Amarendra Pandey was the youngest son of a fabulously wealthy zamindar, a Raja of the province of Pakur in present-day Jharkhand, where their family owned hundreds of acres of fertile farmland and coal mines. Being the son of a filthy rich landlord, Amar could have very well turned out to be a spoilt, entitled brat who frittered away his family's money on carnal pleasures. But no, that distinction would lie with his older half-brother, Benoyendra Pandey. Amar was the sort of young man any family would be proud of. Intelligent, humble, and level-headed, he was genuinely concerned about the future of his family and estate. He'd secured admission to the prestigious Patna College and was determined to acquire a good education before returning to Pakur to manage the lands he'd inherited from his father. But there was just one problem. His father had died when Amar was around 16 years old, which meant that until the young man became an adult, the Pakur estate would be under the control of his older brother, Binoy. By now, Binoy was a fully grown 27-year-old man with his own ideas of how to run the estate, and he didn't like sharing. From the moment he got control of his father's wealth, the Pakur estate basically turned into an open pantry that he was free to raid whenever he liked. Benoy frequently travelled to Calcutta, renting a lavish house and a penthouse suite in the Calcutta hotel, hiring a car and a driver, and hosting wild parties where he and his friends got to enjoy the finest whiskies and prostitutes to be found in the city. It wasn't just that Benoy drank and slept around. That wasn't uncommon among rich high society men. It's that he was so brazen about it. He had a local courtesan who he kept in a bungalow in Pakur, besides which he had a girlfriend in Calcutta whom he'd whisk away on extravagant holidays in Kashmir and Darjeeling. In the deeply conservative society of 1930s India, such behavior from an upper caste member of a respectable family like the Pandeys was unspeakably scandalous. But the thing about upper caste families back then was that they were governed by strict social norms, where the eldest male member, the Karta, exercised disproportionate power in the family. For the Pandey family, that man was Benoyendra. Even his much older aunt was beholden to the impetuous Binoy, and a youngster like Amar was forced to be obedient to his older brother. Now, the Pandey estate was incredibly rich, but even it had limits on how much it could support Binoy's increasingly profligate lifestyle. Even as Amar was studying hard to earn his degree in Patna, Binoy was busy draining his family's finances by taking loans and blowing up tens of thousands of rupees on entertaining his degenerate social circle in Calcutta. Amar might have just kept his head down and said nothing as long as Binoy was bleeding his own estate dry. But the problem became serious when his older brother began dipping into Amar's inheritance. The resentment had been building for a while. Binoy had forced his brother to stay in a cramped hostel in Patna and was painfully slow in transferring money required for Amar's college fees and day-to-day expenses. But now his older brother was trying to destroy his future by stealing his money to spend on booze and women? This marked the beginning of the 2-year-long feud between the brothers, who wrote furious letters to each other and got lawyers involved. Binoy complained that money was tight and that famines in Pakur had resulted in poor tax collection from the local peasants. The truth was that money was tight, but not because of any famine. Binoy had been steadily running his father's estate to the ground, and his only remaining source of income was Amar's half of the wealth. And he was willing to go to any lengths to secure what he believed was his birthright. And so, he began plotting the downfall of his own brother. In his years partying in Calcutta, Benoy had become close friends with a doctor named Taranath Bhattacharjee. The two men were often seen drinking together, attending plays and movies, and driving recklessly through the streets of Calcutta. Taranath and Benoy got to talking, and eventually, the zamindar cautiously revealed his intentions to get rid of Amar. To his surprise, the doctor agreed with him. But it's not hard to see why. At that point, Taranath had been running a somewhat unsuccessful medical practice in the city, and it would no doubt do wonders to his career if he could have a wealthy Raja of Pakur indebted to him. Now, all they needed was a foolproof plan. Obviously, Benoy didn't just want to send some gundas after Amar to beat him to death. That would attract too much attention. Poisoning was also out of the question. The family would no doubt want an autopsy done, and if they found the poison in his system, fingers would immediately point to the only man with a motive. But there was one other option, proposed by Taranath himself, that actually made a lot of sense. What if Amarendra simply died of natural causes? Perhaps from an unfortunate disease? It's difficult to say whether this was Taranath's own original idea or if he'd read any of the numerous cases of germ-based murders reported around the world in the early 20th century, or even the Sherlock Holmes story, The Adventure of the Dying Detective, which was released in India a decade prior. But suffice it to say, Benoy's interest was piqued, and he began making preparations to execute this brilliant plot. It would later be revealed that Taranath was never actually a licensed doctor. He just added DTM, or Diploma of Tropical Medicine, next to his name, and nobody bothered to check his credentials. But the man had studied microbiology and was well acquainted with handling bacteria. He could think of no better killer microbe than the Yersinia pestis, or the plague bacteria. Yes, that plague, the one that destroyed half of Europe's population in the 14th century and had swept across large parts of India only 3 decades prior, killing millions. So the plan was in place, but now came the hard part, actually getting their hands on a live culture of plague bacteria. Obviously, research laboratories weren't exactly handing out samples of this incredibly dangerous bacteria to random doctors. And besides, Taranath knew of only one place that preserved live cultures of the plague, the Halfkind Institute in Bombay. But when he wrote to the institute saying that he wanted to test a new cure for the plague, they summarily rejected him. Who was this nobody from Calcutta requesting such a dangerous bacterial culture for a personal pet project? If he wanted the culture, he'd need permission from the Surgeon General of Bengal. That was out of the question, so Taranath switched up his tactic. He approached a pulmonologist in Calcutta, Dr. A.C. Ukil, asking to do some research in his lab. Either Ukil was stupidly naive or Taranath was so charming that he managed to convince him to request a plague culture from Bombay. But the experiment was a disappointment. The plague bacteria failed to multiply and he had to destroy the culture. Taranath tried to ask Dr. Ukil to request another culture, but by now, the senior doctor was getting annoyed with this fellow and flatly refused him. This wasn't going to be easy. Refusing to give up, Taranath decided on a new course of action. If he couldn't get the plague culture, he'd have to try the next best thing. In October 1932, Amar was visiting the family home in Deoghad for Durga Puja when Benoy arrived in a car. This was unexpected. Benoy didn't usually attend these family events. Something more unexpected? He greeted Amar warmly, embraced him, and invited him for a private stroll in the orchard near the house. As Amar and Benoy talked about their father's estate and the division, Benoy yet again did something totally out of character. He offered Amar a gift, a pince-nez, a type of eyeglasses very fashionable in those days. Amar tried on the glasses but handed them back, saying they were too small. Nonsense, Benoy said, taking the pince-nez and forcefully jamming it onto the bridge of his nose, making Amar wince in pain. The nose piece broke the skin on his nose, causing a tiny wound. But what Amar didn't know was that the nose piece had been smeared with a deadly bacterial culture that, in that very moment, had entered his bloodstream and was already multiplying. Initially, Amar seemed fine and the Durga Puja festivities went on as normal. But within a few days, Amar took badly ill, running a high fever and suffering from lockjaw, rendering him unable to speak. Frantically, the family called for their doctor, who, upon observing the young man, rendered the terrifying diagnosis. Amar was infected with tetanus. Amar was 12 years younger than Benoy and was barely 16 when their father died. Both brothers had lost their mothers at a young age and were raised by their aunt, Surjabati Devi. An intelligent woman with a mind for business, Surjabati had taken over the reins of her late husband's massive estate, which made her over 1 lakh rupees a year, a huge sum in those days. But there was one thing she lacked but deeply desired: children. So when Benoy and his sister were left motherless, Surjabati gladly assumed the role of mother to the young ones. As the only son and heir to his father's enormous estate, Benoy was treated like a prince and could have and do whatever he pleased in his kingdom. He would go out onto the terrace of the family bungalow in Pakur and look out into the distance. Practically everything within sight was his. But all that changed when his father got remarried and had 2 children, a daughter and another son. All of a sudden, the sprawling lands he was to inherit would be split in half. But Amar got a more than equal share of something 12-year-old Benoy greatly valued: the affections of their foster mother, Surjabati Devi. Since Amar's mother died in childbirth, the baby was in Surjabati's care from the very beginning, and she treated Amar more like a son than she ever could Benoy. No doubt this rankled the young Benoy, as his special status was stripped from him, and he felt isolated from the very family that had for so long put him on a pedestal. These would have been the thoughts running through Benoy's mind as he drove back from Deogarh to his house in Calcutta, where he'd wait to receive a telegram from Surjabati informing him about Amar's horrible tetanus affliction. There was no time to lose. The Pandey's family doctor was already treating Amar, and he couldn't be allowed to recover. Benoy set off back to Deogarh, this time with Taranath in tow. When they arrived there, Taranath immediately began trying to interfere with Amar's treatment, suggesting that instead of tetanus serum, they administer morphine to relax his muscles and ease the pain. The family doctor, an experienced physician by the name of Saurendra Mukherjee, grew suspicious of Taranath and his bogus remedy. Morphine would simply render Amar unconscious as the infection continued to take control of his body. There was no way a real doctor would suggest such a foolish treatment for a tetanus patient. He flatly refused to listen to Taranath, and even the family would later recall feeling something was off about this unknown Calcutta doctor. His plan temporarily foiled, Benoy went back to the city with Taranath and returned some days later with another doctor who recommended giving him even more serum to fight the injection. Reluctantly, Mukherjee agreed. This would turn out to be the wrong course of action. While Amar did eventually recover from the illness, his heart was permanently damaged from the aggressive treatment, and he even developed a pus-filled cavity in his pelvis that had to be surgically cleaned and disinfected. At the end of it all, Amar was alive, but significantly weakened by the whole ordeal. It would leave him with a permanent fear of doctors and hospitals. To make matters worse, Benoy was constantly delaying sending money to his brother for the costly medical bills, which never seemed to end. Amar was forced to take loans just to keep himself alive, while Benoy did everything in his power to draw tens of thousands of rupees from Amar's inheritance. The entire matter only further raised the suspicions of Surjabati Devi and the rest of the family, who now strongly believed that the older brother had some devilish hand in this crisis. For Benoy, there was still work to be done. The tetanus plan had almost worked. Almost. But Amar was back on the move, trying everything in his power to effect the transfer of property from Benoy to him. The only thing holding Amar back was that damn sense of duty to his older brother, the family's Karta, that still persisted despite all these years of injustice against him. Benoy needed to act quickly because ultimately the law was on Amar's side, and if he took the matter to court, there was little doubt who the judge would rule in favor of. So he and Taranath decided to take matters into their own hands by traveling to Bombay in order to source the plague culture. If these arrogant scientists refused to respond via telegram, Benoy would go meet them in person. Surely his skills of persuasion would work on them. His first target was the head of plague research at the Halfkind Institute, Dr. B.P.B. Naidu. He had the audacity to visit the man's apartment, claiming that his friend, a doctor from Calcutta, wanted facilities to test a new plague cure. As inviting as the prospect was to give a complete stranger access to world-class facilities purely as a favor, Dr. Naidu had to respectfully decline, saying that they needed the permission of the director of the institute. Not to be deterred, Benoy then accosted 2 veterinary surgeons at the institute and repeatedly tried to bribe them to give this doctor from Calcutta access to their lab. Again, both of them said no, but they did offer one useful piece of information. He could try asking at the Arthur Road Hospital, the only place in Bombay that still treated the plague. What's strange is that neither of these doctors ever thought about reporting their interaction with this overly persistent man to their superiors. I mean, think about it. If a complete stranger approached you, repeatedly pestering you to give his doctor friend, whom you've never seen or heard of by the way, access to a highly sensitive laboratory with dangerous pathogens, wouldn't you at least be a little suspicious? What's even more surprising is that Benoy actually managed to find a doctor at the Arthur Road Hospital who agreed to help him out. The man probably thought these were some newbie doctors trying to invent a useless cure for the plague and figured there was no harm in making some extra money from them. For Benoy and Taranath, the hardest part was over, and now it was time for the next stage of their plan, figuring out the best way to infect Amar with the plague. By the way, if you're enjoying this video, I'd really appreciate if you drop a like and subscribe to my channel. And if you want to support me in making more high quality documentaries like this, you can become a member of my channel to get early access to videos, vote for upcoming video topics, and more. Just click join under this video or on my channel to get started. Now back to the video. Taranath went to Crawford Market to pick up a couple of rats for some experiments. After carefully developing a viable plague culture in the lab, Taranath administered the bacteria to the rodents. On one of them, he simply applied the bacteria onto a patch of bare skin, and the other he injected with the bacteria. Both creatures died within 24 hours. It would have been most convenient if Benoy could simply rub a bacterial solution onto Amar's skin and infect him. But human skin is much too thick and resistant to allow for germs to simply be absorbed. So it was decided, an injection was the only viable means of administering the deadly dose. But how would they accomplish this? Surely Amar would notice someone trying to inject him with something. He was already paranoid about doctors and medical procedures. And besides, who would be willing to commit the act itself? This plan would have to be even more complex than his last one. With his highly virulent plague culture bottled up, sealed and stored securely in his briefcase, Taranath boarded the train to Calcutta, where Benoy was already executing the next stage of their diabolical scheme. In November 1933, Amar received a telegram from Calcutta that read, "Come Calcutta after court hours. Do not anything without consulting me. Surjabati." Amar, ever the loyal nephew, hurried to meet Surjabati in her rented house in Calcutta. But when he walked through the front door, his aunt looked at him in bemusement. After a brief exchange, Amar realized that his aunt had never in fact sent the telegram. They immediately understood who was behind it. But what could Benoy possibly want with Amar to trick him into coming to the city? Tension gripped the family, most of all Surjabati Devi, who was nervously anticipating some terrible scheme by the older brother. But nothing happened. Benoy even visited Amar and told him that if he really wanted to partition the estate, he would do so amicably. Amar accepted it but remained cautious nonetheless. Something didn't feel right. A few days later, Amar, along with his sisters, Surjabati Devi and some cousins, headed to the Howrah railway station where they'd be getting on a train back to Pakur. That's when they saw a sight that put them all on edge. Benoyendra was approaching them on the platform, a broad smile on his face. Apparently, he was there to see them off, but this was yet another instance of highly unusual behavior from Benoy, who normally never bothered to check on them or visit them in Calcutta. And now he was helping them load their bags onto the train? As the train arrived and the platform became crowded, something happened that would be seared into the mind of Surjabati Devi for the rest of her life. A strange man, dark-skinned, wearing simple homespun clothes, was walking past their group when he bumped hard into Amar. The young man cried out in pain, "I've been pricked!" The group tried to locate the stranger, but he'd already melted away into the crowded platform, leaving Amar to massage his arm. Surjabati quickly checked where the boy had been pricked and saw that a sticky liquid was oozing out onto his shirt sleeve, and there was a red pinprick on his skin. In an instant, Amar felt all his energy leave him, his face gone pale with fear. Everyone else was thinking the same thing. This couldn't have been a coincidence. First the eyeglasses laced with tetanus, then the fake telegram calling Amar to Calcutta, then Benoy arriving at the train station, and now this? Deeply shaken by the possibility that Amar's life was in very real danger, the entire family urged him to stay in Calcutta and see a doctor. But Benoy was standing right there, and when they told him what happened, he dismissed the issue, saying it was nothing. He hadn't even checked Amar's arm. He hurriedly ushered everyone towards the carriage, but when his cousin insisted that Amar stay back and get himself checked, Benoy lost his temper. He told them to stop making a mountain out of a molehill and practically forced Amar into the train carriage. Once more, the rigid social norms of 1930s India took precedence over the good judgment of the family members who even now couldn't speak up against the Karta of the family. Even now, despite their completely justified concerns, Benoy got his way, and he stayed to make sure the train left the station without further incident. For Amar, the journey back to Pakur was filled with a deep sense of foreboding, and beneath it all, a silent capitulation to fate. At one point, he even told his cousin, "My brother is determined to take my life. What precaution can I take?" Amar felt normal for a few days as he went about his daily business in Pakur, organizing ledgers, receipts, and land records for the impending partition of the estate. He'd almost forgotten about the incident at the railway station. But soon, he began to show signs of illness. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, Amar's family urged him to go back to Calcutta, where he consulted with one of the top doctors in the city. Initially, the doctor found nothing wrong with Amar and just gave him some simple medicines against bacteria. But the next day, Amar was running a high fever and his condition was rapidly deteriorating. Alarmed, the doctor sent samples of Amar's blood to a lab for testing. He initially didn't believe Amar's story about someone pricking him with an injection at the train station. But with each passing day, as more and more doctors were called to the house, treating Amar with pneumonia serums, Ayurvedic medicines, and whatever else they could think of, the doctors realized that there was nothing ordinary about this particular case. Amar's body became swollen in several places and his lungs were filling with fluid, making it a struggle for him to breathe. Within a few days, Amar was unable to speak, required supplemental oxygen just to stay alive, and was showing no signs of improvement. Eventually, Amarendra Pandey lost the battle against the plague on 4th December 1933, the life leaving his body one ragged breath at a time. Benoyendra had been staying at a house less than a mile away. Not once had he come to visit. As Surjabati Devi sank into grief, Benoy suddenly showed up, readily taking on the responsibility of performing the last rites for his brother and cremating his body. Under his watch, no autopsy was performed, and the cause of death was ruled to be pneumonia. People later recalled Benoy being cheerful and spirited when he took the body to the cremation ghat, and he even bribed the registrar to quickly and quietly perform the funeral rites. At this point, Benoy was riding high. His Machiavellian murder plot had gone off without a hitch, leaving no messy aftermath and no direct evidence against him. All that was left was to finalize the paperwork and, reluctantly of course, accept the transfer of his brother's estate to himself. But if he'd ever bothered to visit Amar during his illness, Benoy would have known that there was still one piece of evidence that did exist, just one little thing that, once it got out, would blow this case wide open. That blood sample taken from Amar just a few days ago. Because when the lab results came in, everyone in the family found out that Amarendra had died of the bubonic plague. Things moved faster than Benoy could ever have anticipated. The Pandey family lodged a complaint with the police, and the Deputy Commissioner of Police in Calcutta got personally involved in the case. When he tried to flee, Benoy was the first to be arrested, followed by Taranath and 2 other doctors he'd hired. They would never end up finding the mysterious assassin who had administered the deadly injection, but the investigation quickly unraveled the sordid details of Benoyendra's clumsy plan. Neither Benoy nor Taranath had been particularly careful about hiding their tracks, and the police easily tracked their movements through Pakur, Deoghar, Calcutta and Bombay, revealing how the 2 men had planned multiple attempts on Amar's life. A slew of medical experts were called on to testify on the details of the case. Meanwhile, Benoy and Taranath were put through rigorous cross-examinations, where they offered confusing and conflicting accounts of events. most of which were shown to be false by witness testimonies. The court sentenced Benoyendra Pandey and Taranath Bhattacharjee to death, but they appealed the case before the Calcutta High Court. It wasn't until January 1936 that the High Court gave its final verdict, setting aside the death penalty but sentencing both men to life imprisonment in the cellular jail in the Andaman Islands, one of the most brutal prisons in all of British India. We don't really know too much about what happened to Benoyendra and Taranath after all this. Reports say that Taranath went mad during his time in jail. As for Benoy, after India gained independence in 1947, he was among the many prisoners granted amnesty, and he ended up going back to Pakur. But 10 years in jail had turned him neurotic and paranoid. An unconfirmed report said that after he returned to Pakur, he sank deeper into madness until he began threatening his wife with a gun. When the police were called, he locked himself up in a room and was killed in a shootout. When I think about this case, the thing I keep coming back to is the futility of this entire endeavor. The Pandey family's zamindari had roots all the way back to the Mughal Empire. They had come to power under the rule of Akbar and had continued to rule Pakur through the rise and fall of the Mughals, the Nawabs of Murshidabad, the British East India Company, and finally the British Crown. How much longer might their family have prospered if Benoyendra had simply chosen to honor the terms of his father's will? The brothers would get hundreds of acres of land each. Was that not enough? But because of the blind greed of one man, an innocent young man was murdered in cold blood. Their whole family was destroyed, and he never even got to enjoy the wealth he had killed for. And so, with a twist of fate and a fatal squeeze of a syringe, the story of a 400-year-old dynasty came abruptly to an end. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like, subscribe to my channel, and leave a comment. You can also support my channel by becoming a member, where you'll get early access to videos, vote on my upcoming video topics, and ask me questions each month. I'm Anish Bhargav, and I'll see you in the next one.